Good afternoon, City Club members and guests. My name is Megan O'Brien, and I am the Executive Director of the newly created nonprofit organization called the Cleveland Transformation Alliance, which was an outgrowth of the Cleveland Plan and was created to be the organizing and advocacy group in our city around reinventing public education. Our mission at the Transformation Alliance is to ensure that every single child in Cleveland attends an excellent school and that every neighborhood has a multitude of quality school choices from which families can choose. It's my pleasure today to get to introduce Dr. Pedro Noguera, the Peter L. Agnew Professor of Education at New York University, a thought leader in the world of education reform and the author of several books, including Creating the Opportunity to Learn. The United States has been in perpetual public education reform for over 30 years. It was 1983 when the release of A Nation at Risk by the Reagan administration warned of declining academic performance of American students. The debate has become very political and often results in political problem solving. What we hear in the news most often is about the entrenched battles between teachers' unions and administrations, or the new curriculum and testing requirements established by governments. Governments, which at all levels are extremely divided as to what the best policy agenda is needed to educate our youth in a global economy. Across the country, school districts are taking baby steps in one direction or another to address high dropout rates and an increasingly growing education gap. Locally, we've seen giant steps taken in terms of unprecedented collaboration between our city's school district, our teachers' union, our charter sector, and the business community to reinvent public education as we know it in our city. But no matter where we are on the public education reform continuum, we can all learn from Noguera's work as he reminds us that so often the policies and political processes employed to solve the problem of public education do not address the socioeconomic conditions that are often the source of the public school system's struggles. And equally important, policy changes often do not take into account how students learn, but are based upon what students should learn. Pedro Noguera stresses the great need for those of us who support public education to organize, and that is a key role that the Cleveland Transformation Alliance can and will play in our city. Noguera urges parents and educators to hold politicians and systems accountable, as challenges being faced by public school systems are not going to go away, and in fact, they're likely to worsen. As we continue to undergo demographic and economic changes, our public schools need to figure out how to shift to meet those changes. Dr. Noguera's research focuses on the way schools are influenced by social and economic conditions and demographic shifts. Excuse me. Dr. Noguera holds faculty appointments in the departments of teaching and learning and humanities and social sciences at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Development. Pedro is the executive director of the Metropolitan Center for Urban Education as well. Dr. Noguera received his bachelor's degree in sociology and history and a master's degree in sociology from Brown University. He earned his doctorate in sociology from the University of California at Berkeley. Ladies and gentlemen of the City Club, let's give a warm welcome for Dr. Noguera.
Thanks, Megan. Good afternoon. It is truly a pleasure to be here and a real honor to have a chance to address you at the Cleveland City Club. When I got the invitation several months ago and I saw the long list of previous speakers, I said, well, what an honor to be included on such a list. And so I'm pleased to be here. And I had a chance last night to speak to teachers in the union at Cleveland State, which I thoroughly enjoyed. This morning I spoke to superintendents in the region, and I top it off with all of you for lunch. So it's a real pleasure, and despite the frigid temperatures out there, it's feeling warm and welcoming here. I'm going to speak today about education. I know you've had other speakers, my friends Diane Ravitch and Linda Darling-Hammond. You'll also hear from yet another friend, David Kerp, in a few months. And so it's good to be a part of that conversation. And it's also a reminder that regardless of how many other critical issues facing our country come up, education stays right there on the agenda. Whether the economy is in the tank, or we're at war or multiple wars, or we're dealing with some environmental crisis, we know we cannot afford to not address education. The problem is, as Megan already pointed out, we've been addressing education for a while through reforms. And one of the questions we have to ask is, why aren't our schools getting better with all this attention? And I want to probe that, but I want to start by saying that education, unlike many other fields, is the one field where, because everyone went to school once, they think they're experts. And it's also the field where, unfortunately, those who know the most have the least say, and those who know the least have the most say. And so, not surprisingly, we end up with policies that a lot of times make no sense and don't have any real impact on improving the quality of schools or outcomes for our students. Now, I'll probe that further, but I just want to point out that something is wrong with what we're doing. And all you have to do is look at the international comparisons and see that we keep falling further and further behind to know that much of what's coming from Washington, from both Republicans and Democrats, is not solving this problem. So I would say we're fixated on the wrong thing. But before I get to that, I want to take us back in history, because we have a very proud history in education. We are the first country to develop a system of public education. And we did it not because of the federal government. We did it because small towns, starting in Massachusetts and then spreading elsewhere, decided that we thought it was in our interest to educate our children at the public's expense. And the vision guiding that expansion of education, a vision articulated by Horace Mann, the first Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, was that we wanted schools to be the equalizer of opportunity, because we didn't want America to be a nation where your birth and who your parents were determined opportunity. We wanted to be a nation where it was talent and merit that determined how far you could go. So the children of bankers should get no more in terms of education than the children of farmers. That was the ideal, at least. And it was such a powerful ideal that, again, without the support of the federal government, public schools spread. And as we trace the spread of public education, in many ways we can trace the expansion of American democracy. Because as we decided to educate more and more people, we had to acknowledge their rights, their fundamental rights. So not surprising, the last region in this country to get public schools was the South. Not just for African Americans, but for white Americans as well, because we in the agrarian South did not educate poor white children until Reconstruction. And as we continued through history to decide that we should educate not just African Americans, but women and children who don't speak English as their first language and the learning disabled, we continue to recognize that the right to an education was a fundamental right, even though it's not mentioned in our Constitution. And what's interesting about that is that, unlike the other rights that are in our Constitution, which are framed largely in negative terms, so we have the right to bear arms, but fortunately, we are not issued arms. Right? And we have the right to free speech, but we don't have access to a radio or a newspaper, right? Unless you are Rupert Murdoch or someone like that. Right? But with education, you actually get an entitlement. You have the right to go to school. And we understood that that was important because, especially in a nation of immigrants, a nation that was bringing people from all over the world. Alexis de Tocqueville, the French philosopher visiting this country in 1830, said, imagine a nation comprised of people from all over the world, speaking many different languages. What will hold them together? And the answer in this country has always been our schools. Our schools will hold us together because it is in school where we will learn this common language, where we will learn civic values, where we will understand what it means to be an American. And that's the reason why education has been so critical. It's the reason why we integrated this society, ended the racial barriers through education. The reason why Eisenhower, Republican president, sent troops to Little Rock, Arkansas. So our history of education is completely tied to the history of American democracy, and still is. And if we're concerned about the future of democracy and whether or not our citizens will be able to solve the problems of previous generations, we should be really concerned about what's happening in our schools today. For many American children today, our public schools are all that's left of the social safety net in this country. It is the only institution that serves all children, regardless of their status. The undocumented, courts have ruled, have a right to an education in America. The homeless, the children of the incarcerated, the children from the trailer parks, from the housing projects, all children in America have an education, not an equal education. But at the minimum, they get a chance to be in a warm building with adult supervision, in many cases, lunch and even breakfast, and sometimes even access to a school nurse. And while we might say that's inadequate, we want much more. We want them to also learn to read and write. Well, we should not make light of what is provided, because there is no other institution that's stepping up and said, we will take those children. And so I would encourage you to challenge those who say this system of public education needs to be dismantled to ask what will replace it. Because this is the only institution that's really binding this nation together, as weak and as flawed as it is. You know, I often say that I feel about public schools the way I feel about the Knicks. I love the Knicks. But if you were to watch me while I watch the Knicks, you would say he hates the Knicks. They play terribly. They're really doing badly right now. But the reason why I'm so hard on them is because I love the Knicks. And that's how I feel about public education. I am critical of the misdirection. I'm critical of a lot of what I see going on in school, where kids are too often bored, where we focus so much more on control than we do on getting kids excited about learning. I'm particularly critical of our policymakers and the decisions I see being made at state capitals and in Washington, which I think make the job of educating our children that much more difficult. I'm critical, but I remain a supporter, because I understand that education is so important to our future. Education is implicated in all of the major problems facing this country, from the troubles in our economy and the labor market to our environment, to health, to crime. It's also implicated in the potential solutions. So whether or not you have children in schools, whether or not you have children in public schools, we should all be concerned about what's happening in those schools, because the future of this country will be determined by how well we educate the next generation. It's that important. But now, with poverty rates higher than we've seen in over 30 years, particularly for children, where 22% of children in this country come from families at poverty levels, higher than any other industrialized nation other than Romania. We don't like to be compared to Romania, do we? We shouldn't. We cannot expect that public schools can solve this by themselves. And that's exactly what we're doing. We are blaming schools for problems that schools cannot solve. Hungry children don't do well in school. We got good evidence of that. And we know right now there are lots of hungry children. Some of the children who are struggling in school with reading need eyeglasses. We are thinking so narrowly about achievement that we are ignoring all the other factors that influence outcomes for kids, because you cannot separate academic achievement from child development. But our policymakers pretend as though it were equity to hold the kids in Cleveland to the same standards as the kids in Shaker Heights, even though we know the kids in Cleveland come to school with far more needs and often don't have the resources. Now, let me be clear. This is not to say that poverty is a learning disability. Absolutely not. We have ample evidence that poor children can succeed, can learn, can thrive under the right conditions. However, we have also substantial evidence that when poverty is ignored, it can be disabling. The achievement gap that we have been fixated on for the last several years is nothing more than an educational manifestation of social inequality. What's driving those gaps in achievement are family income, parent education, ill health. And if we think that we can close these gaps without addressing those other aspects of inequality, we are fooling ourselves. No other country does this. When you disaggregate the data in the United States, you really find that inequality is at the heart of our educational problem in America today. And so we need a different strategy. We need a strategy that is far more ambitious than what we've seen so far. It needs to both take into account the academic needs of children and the non-academic needs. Because in a child, you can't separate the physical, the emotional, the psychological from the intellectual. But I would say beyond that, we need to ask a different set of questions. We've been focused on how to raise achievement as measured by how well a child does on a test. That's a wrong question. Tests were never intended to be used that way. The whole value of testing is for diagnostic purposes, to get good feedback to the educated and hopefully to the parents about what a child needs, not to rank. And that's what we're using testing for, to rank, to monitor, to measure. You don't get smarter by being tested. And instead of focused on how to raise achievement, you know what we should focus on? How to get kids excited about learning. That's what we should focus on. Think about the question. And think about how differently, if we said, schools, your job is to get these kids excited about learning so they'll want to come, so they'll be invested and motivated. That's your job. Ignore the test scores. We want those kids to want to read. We want them to read so much that it's summertime, they're reading. The library has a line out the door. That's what we want. And we'll know you're succeeding when we see the demand for education grow. Well, what would that do? It would tap into the creative aspects of teaching, which some teachers have never lost, but some have increasingly moved away from because they're fixated on test scores too. And if you're fixated on test scores, then you fixate on test preparation. And that's why we go to schools now where art has been taken away and music's taken away and anything that's not on the test is taken away from children, poor children. I even saw a study that said that eating lunch was good for test scores. I said, thank God. Or they might take lunch too. But guess what? Our kids need lunch and recess and phys ed and art. They need a well-rounded education. They always have. It was common in this country for every kindergarten classroom to have a piano up until the 1960s. And for every kindergarten teacher to know how to play the piano. Why? Because we understood that music was a foundation for learning. It still is. It still is. So we need to focus on a different set of questions. And when we see that happen, great things can happen in schools. I can describe schools right now. School Mission Hill in Boston. Go into a kindergarten classroom, there's a boat in the middle of the room. I'm asking, first of all, how to get there? So the parents built the boat. I said, well, why is it there? I said, that's where we do reading. And then I got it. Because you put a 5-year-old in a boat, they're gone. They're gone. And why? Because they want to capture the imagination. They don't simply want to drill. Right? Go into the science teacher's classroom. From the time you enter the room, you want to learn science. Because he's got all kinds of creatures in jars, and he's got plants, and he's got skeletons, and you want to know, what is that? Because that teacher understands that to teach science, you actually have to engage the mind. Great teachers have always understood that. Why is it today that the number one response you'll get from a student when you ask them, how was school, is boring? Why? Because too much sitting and listening, too much drill and kill, too much passive learning. We need to make our schools places where kids are excited about learning. We need to move away from the idea that we can use fear as a motivator. That's what we've been doing for the last several years. Fear of failure. So we tell the kids, you don't pass the test, no diploma. Tell the teachers, they don't pass the test, no job. Tell the principal, they don't pass this, you're out too. And then if they all fail, we'll shut it down. That's the Mike Bloomberg strategy. Shut it down. He's closed over 160 schools and proud of it. I said, if that many schools failed under your leadership, some of which you started, I don't know any CEO who would say that's a good thing. But they followed that example in Philadelphia, shutting down schools left and right, Chicago shutting down schools. This is not a viable strategy. We need to create new schools, schools that tap into the energy and vitality of our communities, schools that get our kids thinking and get our kids prepared for life as adults in this country. Our schools should be the engine of economic development in our community. And they could be, if we thought differently about how to link learning to the possibilities that exist out there. I helped to set up a biotech academy over 20 years ago in the Bay Area. We were working with a struggling school, and we were asking ourselves, how do we get these kids who were from a school for the kids who had dropped out of other schools. It was a kind of last chance alternative school. And the principal said, why don't you go talk to the students, find out what will get them to come to class, because they're coming to school, but they don't go to class. And they're hanging out in the parking lot, and they're smoking weed, but they're not really here to learn. So I go out into the parking lot, and I find out, you know what? All of the kids at this school were old enough to quit if they wanted. But they were coming. They weren't in class learning, but they were coming because they still thought they needed a degree. And then I spent more time talking to them. And I would encourage you, be willing to talk to the students. You could learn a whole lot about what's working and what's not. And the number one issue that was driving them was survival. They were worried about how they were going to survive because many of them came from struggling families. And I went back to the principal. I said, you know what we need to do here? We need to show these kids that it's possible to support themselves legally with education. He said, well, I don't know how to do that. I said, well, you know what? I know the CEO of Bayer Laboratories. Bayer Laboratories is a big biotech firm, produces Bayer aspirin, among other things. It's a German firm. And they wanted to expand operations in Berkeley, so I said to the CEO, why don't we develop a career academy, a biotech academy in our community? And because they're a German firm, and in Germany they use apprenticeship as a strategy for getting young people into technical fields, he said, well, this makes sense. It makes more sense than anything the city's asked. So we commenced to build a biotech academy. A biotech academy that now involves 7 high schools, 5 biotech firms, 2 community colleges, a 4-year school, gets young people into biotech. In 1988, the starting salary was $15 an hour in biotech. This is not shop class. This is a pathway into a very productive career. I'm on the board right now of Year Up. If you don't know about Year Up, look it up. It is dedicated to closing the opportunity divide, supported only by private dollars. Its mission is to get young people who graduated from high school or who have GEDs and get them into high-paying jobs. And right now, we are getting kids trained within a year to work in high tech, to work in finance, to work in other fields that previously would be shut out by giving them both the academic and the social skills to work in those industries. If we could do that with the kids who are the failures of our school system, what would happen if we created schools earlier to get them prepared for work in health and to work in renewable energy and other fields where we know there will be growth in the future? Where are the jobs of the future in Cleveland? What are you doing to prepare young people now for those jobs? Because whether they go to college or not, they will have to work. And many of them who go to college will have to work while they're in college. And so we need to be more creative about how we think about these connections between our economy and our job. And we need to stop using fear. We need to use hope. Hope for a better life. Hope for a means to support oneself and their family and to uplift their community. The message cannot be to our kids that if you're successful and you work hard, your reward will be to escape. That's why we lose so many talented people from places like Cleveland, isn't it? Because young people graduate and they say, there's nothing for me here, I have to leave. That's why places like Buffalo and the whole state of West Virginia are losing their young people because no one is thinking, how do we retain our future and give them jobs that will allow them to make this place one where they can raise their families and one where we can renew our economy, and our communities. So we need to think differently about these questions. We need to increasingly ask ourselves, what are we doing to create schools where race and socioeconomic status don't predict how well a child will do? Think about that for a moment. It's different than saying we're going to close the achievement gap. It's certainly different than saying that all kids will be above average. That's what we've been lying to ourselves, isn't it? We've been saying that was No Child Behind's premise by the year 2014. Guess what year it is? All children will be at proficiency. Finally, Secretary Duncan said, I don't think it's going to happen. Well, guess what? That would make us a Lake Wobegon nation, right? Where all men are strong, all women are good looking. Guess what? That's a mythical place. In real life, we're not all strong and good looking, and we're not all above average. Right? We should be focused on how to get kids well prepared for the future, but we should also be focused to ensure that our schools are in the business of cultivating talent in children and not merely measuring and sorting. That's what we've been doing. We know how to cultivate talent if you have talent in athletics, don't we? We can find football players out of the projects. We can find basketball players out of one-room shacks. We can find athletes out of any condition because why? We value athletics. There's a little town in Florida, Belgrade, right outside of West Palm Beach. It's produced more professional football players than any town in America over the last 20 years. Because we love football. They say it's because the grass is high. I bet if we cared enough, we could produce scientists and writers and artists out of Belgrade too. But we don't have the values. So ultimately, what this comes down to is our values and our will. Do we care enough? Are we willing to do the work of creating schools that get kids engaged? Are we willing to do the work of addressing those non-academic needs? We should, because many of us have benefited from that, haven't we? How many of you come from a family where neither of your parents graduated from college? Raise your hand. Look around the room. Over half the people. How many of you come from a family where neither parent graduated from high school? Anybody? One. Me too. Neither parent graduated from high school. My parents sent all 6 of us to college, the best colleges in the country. Living proof that your background need not determine what you can accomplish. That's the dream. That's the goal. Because we know that in the trailer parks and in the projects, there are talented kids who need opportunity. That's what we should be focused on. So my question to you here in Cleveland is this. Do you love your children as much as you love those Browns? Because I know you're willing to put public money into the Browns, aren't you? You're willing to spend on the Browns. No matter how much they lose, you still love the Browns, don't you? Do you love your children as much? Because believe it or not, your future as a city is much more contingent on what happens in your schools than what happens to the Browns. You will not attract businesses who want to stay here. You will not be able to keep their employees if the schools are in shambles. Ask your real estate agents. They'll tell you right now property values are very much dependent upon the quality of the schools. So whether you're a business leader, whether you're retired, well, especially if you're retired. If you're retired and you're worried about Social Security, you should really be concerned about public education right now. Because we need to make sure there are lots more people gainfully employed. Those immigrants that we are trying to chase out, we should be saying, please send more. Send more because the immigrants continue to support our economy, doing the work that Americans have refused to do. This country must invest in its children. This city must invest in its children. Otherwise, this city has no future. It's that critical. And the investments have to be wise. They have to be carefully expended. But at the same time, we cannot afford to wait. We can't afford to allow our politics to get in the way. We can't afford to expect someone to deliver us or that a few boutique schools here or there will solve it. It's going to take much more than that. So I encourage you to stay engaged as a community with your public schools. I encourage you to ask tough questions of the educators we choose to have lead our schools, but also to support them. There should be no child in Cleveland who needs a tutor that can't get one. There should be no child in Cleveland that needs a coat in the winter that can't get one. We need to embrace these children and embrace these schools. Our future depends on it. So I wish you all the very best. I thank you for inviting me today.
Thank you so much for that inspiration. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a Friday forum featuring Dr. Pedro Noguera, Professor of Education at New York University. We encourage you to formulate questions for our speaker and remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here today and those joining us via broadcast on WVIZ PBS, 90.3 WCPN, and 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, WTAM, or one of our many broadcast partners across the country. Broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Next Friday, January 31st, at the City Club, we will host a panel discussion on Ohio's heroin epidemic. For a complete list of City Club programs, or to make a reservation, order a CD or DVD of one of our many programs, please visit our website, www.cityclub.org. We welcome guests today at tables hosted by Baker Hostetler, Cleveland Teachers Union, Greater Cleveland School Superintendents Association, Neighborhood Progress, Inc., Northeastern Ohio Education Association, and Shaker Heights City Schools. Today's program is part of the City Club's Education Innovation Series, sponsored by a generous grant by the Nordson Corporation Foundation. Joining us at the head table today is Executive Director of the Foundation, Cecilia Render. Will you please stand and be recognized, Cecilia? Today is also the Bernice Kerrigan Smith Forum on Education, made possible by a generous gift from her family, honoring her career as an educator. Thank you for your support. We welcome students to today's program. Student participation is made possible by a generous gift from the Pipeline Development Company. Today we welcome students from Shaker High School. I think we were expecting other schools, but school was canceled today. So Shaker Heights High School. Will the students please stand to be recognized? Where are you? Oh, there you are. Good. Thanks. Now we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, members and guests. Holding the microphone today are Program Director Carrie Miller and Administrative Assistant Kirsten Pianka. Just Kirsten. So can we see if we have our first question, please? Oh, great.
There often seems to be a tension between creating or replicating excellent schools, top-rated schools, which don't necessarily serve all kids, as many disadvantaged kids or kids with disabilities, and strengthening or creating schools that will really reach everybody and are enrolling all the kids. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that you raise a very important point. That is that the easiest kids to educate are the kids who come from the most privileged backgrounds. And the reason for that is because their parents are doing most of the work. Right? They've been doing that work since the child was born. They've been reading to them and providing the enriched learning environment at home and reinforcing throughout school. And it's not to say that it's not important for those kids to continue getting education. It is. But we've already demonstrated we can do that pretty well as a country. What we're not so good at is educating the kids who come with needs and creating schools that can address those needs. And that's, I think, the real struggle. And it's one of the criticisms of some charter schools, that some of our better charter schools are good, but in part because they're not serving their share of children in poverty or children with learning disabilities or English language learners. So I think we have to constantly ask questions about equity and access. Are children from disadvantaged families also able to access those good schools? And once they're there, what happens? Are those schools able and ready to meet their needs? Do those children experience growth and that opportunity to learn that other children experience? So I think it's a critical question, particularly an important question for our suburban schools, which a lot of times have the resources, but also have these huge disparities when you start to look at how well children from poorer backgrounds are being served.
Doctor, in your remarks in inspiring children to feel that they were involved and interested, you used the example of the science teacher whose classroom had all kinds of things in it, including a skeleton. Who paid for the skeleton? And if it was the school district instead of the teacher out of their own back pocket, how do we get school districts to pay for that kind of inspiration?
That's a good question. I honestly can't tell you who paid for the skeleton. Knowing the school as I do, this is a school founded by Deborah Meyer, a renowned educator. She's a pretty resourceful person, and so she's the kind of person that knows how to get donations, and that's part of the inequity that we see. You know, the schools that are led by visionary, entrepreneurial principals do get lots. They get grants, they get parents give them things. What about the schools that are serving the kids in the poor, rural, or urban areas? And so I think that's, you know, money does matter. The only people who say money doesn't matter are people who have lots of money, right? But the question is, what are we spending it on? I think we've made a lot of misinvestments in school. We've squandered a lot of resources on things that don't impact children the way that we would hope. But creating a learning environment where kids get motivated to want to study science or math or whatever it is, that's an investment worth making. Now, it also means preparing that teacher so they know how to use it and know how to create that environment for the children. But I think those are the kinds of investments we should be making.
Thank you, Dr. Noguera, for your comments. One thing you said that resonated with me was, how do we get children to be excited about learning? Can you give us some examples of individual schools, particularly in urban environments, that have done a good job with this, or even maybe a school district that has done a good job about this?
Let me just mention, because they asked me to mention community roots, or roots of success, rather. Roots of success. It's a curriculum that's being used in many schools now, and particularly, and even in some prisons, to get young people to see how education can be used to study their own local environment. So there's good resources out there that we could bring in. There are schools and districts where this is happening. One of the districts I cite often as a place where you see these gaps closing is Abington, Pennsylvania, right outside of Philadelphia, where you see it is a place where a child's race and socioeconomic status don't predict outcomes. But I can name lots of individual schools, Brockton, Massachusetts, or PS 138. Now, New York City, we have lots of fancy names for our schools, but public school number 138, Willis Avenue, is a school that you wouldn't expect to see excellence, because it's located right across from the housing projects. It's a place that's, you know, characterized by gangs and violence, and here you have this oasis. I'm given a tour of the school by a little girl. She said, I'm your tour guide, because I'd heard about the school. First thing she shows me is all the awards the school's won, the articles written about it. I said, very impressive. She takes me to the library, explains that there's a competition in the school between classes to see which classroom has the kids that read the most books. I said, what do they get? They said, pizza party at the end of the month. Right? But whole books, not excerpts from books. Takes me down the hall, shows me the artwork on display and plants in the hallway. I said, this is a lovely school. I'm so impressed. She said, well, let me take you upstairs. More impressive. I said, what am I going to see upstairs? And I learned that the only museum in New York City dedicated to the history of the Bronx is in their school. But instead of being locked away, it's in the hallways. So the first thing you see is a picture of the Bronx family. German family spelled their name with a K, owned a large farm. See a picture of the Yankees from the 1920s when Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig were on the same team. You see a picture of Joe Louis when he fought Max Schmeling at Yankee Stadium. You see all kinds of memorabilia, Donald Byrd's album, first the jazz artist who lived in that neighborhood, first on display, and it's all within easy reach of children. So I turned to the little girl, I say, aren't they worried that the kids might break this or vandalize it or take it? And she looks at me like I'm some kind of sicko. And she says, you know, I don't know about the schools you go to normally. But at this school, kids take pride and take care of things. So why do I even ask the question? Because I go to schools now where kids are treated like inmates in a prison. I was at a school in Oakland. It's a science classroom. Not only didn't they have a skeleton, they had no science equipment. So I asked the science teacher, where's the science equipment? She said, I lock it up. I said, you lock it up? She said, I lock it up so they won't break it. So I said, well, do they ever get to use the equipment? She said, if they behave, I will occasionally let them use it. And I could tell by the way she said it, That didn't happen very often. It reminded me, you ever go to someone's house and they got their furniture covered? They're waiting for that special guest to come before they unfurl it. And you know that if you come, you're not the special guest because it's still covered, right? Well, the kids at that school, at PS 138, are treated like special guests every day, and they respond like they are, right? And I think that gets at what I'm describing. Schools where kids feel pride and ownership and a desire to learn, and they exist. I'm sorry, they told me I'm not the one calling on hands.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to get back to something you talked about where tests were used to measure knowledge, now they measure rank. And I remember being in school where tests, you know, you got a certain percentage and that was what you got, to, you know, getting ready to leave school and taking the SATs and the GREs, and where the tests measured rank to determine what kind of college or graduate school you were going to get into. How did those kinds of tests insinuate themselves into the schools, and what do we do about it?
Well, that's a very good question. You know, if you trace it, a lot of it did start in Texas, and you know, some people take pride in that. But it came, I think, for a good reason, and the reason was we wanted to know for sure that there was evidence that kids were learning. Right? We know because we had a lot of evidence that some kids were graduating from high school almost functionally illiterate, and the diploma was really questionable. So Texas started us down this path. We're going to use standardized tests as a way to hold students and their schools accountable. In fact, that's part of the reason, you know, President Bush spoke highly of the Texas miracle and named Rod Page, the former superintendent of Houston, the Secretary of Education, based on the miraculous results we thought Houston had delivered. And the only thing we found out later was they also had a really high dropout rate because they realized one way to get test scores up is get rid of kids who bring them down. Right? And what ended up happening, and we saw this, and we've seen it in Texas, we've seen it around the country, is increasingly we started, the only evidence that mattered was the performance on the test. And we ignored all the other things that we knew that in the past were important for learning. And even now, as we're seeing large numbers of kids who have good test scores go to college and have to take remedial courses because they're still not prepared for college because they can't write, they can't think independently, they don't know how to do research, we have clear indication that that strategy has outlived its usefulness. We need a different approach. It doesn't mean we won't assess children. We have to assess. We have to use it, though, as a tool, not a weapon. And right now, I'd say that's what we've been doing. We're using it as a weapon on schools and on teachers rather than as a tool to figure out how to give kids more of what they need.
Doctor, thank you for being here today. My question is more towards the policymakers. Have you seen any examples of a holistic approach from the policy aspect? And can you give me some examples of where to look for that?
You know, sadly, I can't. The closest to it was the Promised Neighborhood Initiative that came through the Obama administration. And originally, the idea was modeled after the Harlem Children's Zone, which many people speak to as a model for a more comprehensive approach. The problem is that it's extremely expensive, right? So it's hard to imagine how you would replicate what Jeffrey Canada has done in Harlem and other communities that don't have access to Wall Street and Goldman Sachs the way he has. But at least I think the administration at one point understood that that model needs to go in other communities. Problem is that Congress didn't fund it, and so we have it's a skeleton of what it should have been. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that there are many communities that, even if they didn't get the funding, are still going ahead and doing their own version of a promised neighborhood. Cleveland is very good. I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma last year, and it was a meeting all about building a social safety net for children. It was funded by an oil company and their foundation that is invested in Tulsa. You know, it's interesting. Oklahoma has more kids in quality preschool than any other state in the country. Right? Oklahoma. You wouldn't expect that. At least I was surprised when I heard that. And I asked the governor of Oklahoma, I said, how come? He said, well, we've seen the research. It really makes a difference to do good quality preschool. I said, well, you need to share that research with some other governors out there who don't seem to get it. So I think that more comprehensive strategy that starts with preschool, that includes health, that includes thinking broadly about the social and emotional needs of children, is taking hold in some places, in some communities. But we've got, what's very important, and I encourage you when Marty Blank comes here, that it's not services or academics. It's got to be both. You've got to think about this in a more integrated manner, because we don't want to have nice services and kids are still not learning anything. Got to do it all.
Hi. From your perspective, is there a role to be played by school choice programs and voucher programs that allow people who can't afford to attend private schools to send their kids to private schools?
So I think the way to think about that is that's a good strategy for helping individuals. It's not a good strategy for helping a whole community, unless they're only good choices. Right? If you don't have lots of good choices to choose from, you end up with winners and losers. Right? We can't afford to produce schools that are for losers. Right? And that's what we've been seeing in cities and states that have developed choice plan. The kids that are lucky to get into those high quality schools, which is a great thing, are the ones, they benefit, but then you have all the others that are stuck and languishing in the underperforming schools. So as a policy strategy for improving the quality of schools, I don't think it works. I see no evidence, and the research shows it hasn't led to general improvement. The schools that are able to, it does benefit individuals who are able to get into good schools. So that's the question, I think. What's the impact we're trying to have? Are we trying to have an impact on a few individuals or a broader impact on a community, and a region?
Doctor, you've mentioned several examples of the importance of creativity and imagination in schooling. What I'm wondering is if you have any thoughts on a policy level of how you replace a culture that's presently characterized by a lot of finger-pointing and distrust, with schools basically being directed to make the schools essentially teacher-proof so that everything is scripted and regimented. How do you replace that culture with a culture that's characterized by trust in the ability of educators at all levels to do what's best for the schools and for the kids?
So if I had it my way, which I don't, education would be nonpartisan. And in fact, it would be like the water supply. Policymakers don't even allow to touch it. Don't even get away from it. Leave that alone. That's the water. Right? We need water. It shouldn't be a Republican water, a Democratic. It should be people who know about water. That's who deals with the water supply. That's who deals with education. We shouldn't allow political agendas to drive our policies. But that's not where we are. We're stuck with the current situation. And that's why I have very little faith in what's happening in Washington or in most state capitals. I would say the hope lies at the local area. The hope lies in cities, hopefully like Cleveland, like Tulsa, like Boston. Look to New York right now. I would say that with our new mayor and chancellor, there's going to be a very different set. He's already said he's going to make universal preschool his #1 priority. She's already said as an experienced educator that she wants to bring hope back into the school, creating learning environments. I think from local communities, we might begin to see a different agenda. If New York could do something that works, it would have ramifications for the whole country, because that's the largest system in the country. So that's where I would put my bet, that the local, it'll be a bottom-up deliverance, not a top-down one.
First, thank you for being here today. The Cleveland Heights, University Heights neighborhood recently had a community book discussion on Diane Ravitch's book, Reign of Error, this past Wednesday, which was very exciting. More than 100 people came out on a cold night to discuss a book. And the next one is Wednesday next week, 7 o'clock, Cleveland Heights High School. But I just wanted to ask you, in the book, Diane Ravitch talks about one of the many corporate reforms from the folks who think they know because they went to school. One of their things they love to say is that fixing schools will fix poverty. And she goes on at length to talk about that statement. Can you comment on that statement?
Yeah, I would say, I think I said it already, schools can't do this by themselves. You know, we know, if you look, for example, you look at the research, again, we made our greatest progress in reducing the achievement gap during the 1970s and 1980s. There's a very important paper I'd encourage you to read by two guys named Barton and Coley called Why Aren't We Making More Progress? And they look at the period when we made the greatest progress and said, well, what was different? So what was different then is we had much more of a commitment to fighting poverty as a nation in terms of jobs, housing, other kinds of social supports. Starting in the 1980s, we retrenched and went away from that. And if you even think about Title I, and we should think about it, it's the 50th anniversary of it, right? Title I, which brought aid to economically disadvantaged children, to districts that had high numbers of impoverished children, was part of the War on Poverty, was enacted in the same year as the Civil Rights Act, or the Voting Rights Act. We were thinking differently about education. Title I today is No Child Left Behind, right? And so we don't, and the irony is that slogan, leave no child behind, came from the Children's Defense Fund. But when Marian Wright Edelman thought no child left behind, she didn't think test the children as frequently as possible. She was thinking about health and nutrition as well. So we can't expect schools to solve this by themselves. All you have to do is look at your data. The schools serving the poorest kids are the schools that are failing. That's what you see. Now ask why. Is it simply because they're lazy teachers? And if we just fire them all, the Michelle Reese strategy, we will solve this? Who's going to replace them? Right? And what's more is, how do you think a teacher, even a gifted teacher, can address the needs of kids who don't have stable housing, who don't have enough to eat? I mean, we can't ignore these are real issues impacting our communities. So yes, we need to focus on the educational needs, but we also need to embrace our schools to get the other services in that we know. What we're trying to do is mitigate the effects of poverty. Right? And mitigating is not the same as getting everybody employed and ending poverty. So but mitigating does have an impact on the children. Right? And it makes poverty bearable so that they can focus on their studies.
Doctor, I was wondering if you could sort of comment. I work for the Urban League, and we have after-school programs, and we have summer programs, and our youth come 95, 97% of the time, and we receive funding from the Nordson Corporation Foundation and other foundations. We even receive funding from the schools because they know the kids come, they get excited. What's our next step? Because we're not actually integrated with the schools. We're not actually partners. We're receiving funding because the kids come, they seem excited, and they transfer that to going to school. But what's our next step? Because we're not a team. We're sort of in two different hemispheres, but we work together somehow.
Well, that's the answer. You already answered the question. There has to be a team. There has to be reinforcement for what you're doing in the schools. For it to have the real impact, the stuff going on in the summer and in the after-school programs has to reinforce what's happening during the school day. If that occurs, the impact on the children will be far greater than if you work in isolation of each other, right? I would also say make sure that the people who are working in the summer and after school are trained, right? In many cases, we are taking people who might be good at building a relationship, but they're not skilled as tutors or as educators. And so we need to make sure there's real quality in those supplemental programs, but also that there's real integration with the school day and reinforcement.
Thank you for speaking today. With home being a huge source of motivation for students to do well in school, what do you think are the first steps to get parents, especially in lower income areas, who are more focused on putting food on their child's plate, more involved in their child's education?
Well, I think that's a very, very important question, because we know parents are the first teacher. And parents who themselves were not well educated or who had bad experiences in school may not necessarily come to school believing that this is a place where my child will get what they need. So we really need to do a lot more work with schools on how to build partnerships with parents. James Coleman, sociologist from Harvard, many years ago studied parochial schools and public schools, looking at the similar population, asked why were the parochial schools getting better results. What he found was it's the parents. Parents trusting schools. It is reinforcement at home for what happens at school. That's what we have to work towards in our public schools. So we've got to do much more work early on getting parents to understand the importance of reading to the child, the importance of reinforcing learning. We've got to make sure that as the child gets older, the parents are limiting the TV, I know you may not like this, limiting the video games, limiting the internet, so that they really are getting encouraged. All parents can do those things. and are more likely to if we ask them to respectfully. And we need to see that as part of our strategy, right? When I say schools can't do it alone, one of the groups they can't do it without are the parents. And we can't simply write parents off as being the problem. Well done? I guess so. Thank you. Thanks, Megan.
Today at the City Club, we have been listening to a Friday forum featuring Dr. Pedro Noguera, Professor of Education at New York University. Thank you so much, Dr. Noguera. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.